Well, in our hometown, we didn't have a whole lot to do, so we were always doing science projects. And I remember in my 5th grade science project, we changed, we actually electroplated copper onto a dime. And then in 6th grade, we changed water into hydrogen and oxygen and back into water again. And then we went to Disneyland, and it was like the National Lampoon Vacation. We had the station wagon, the whole bit. It was 3 days after Walt Disney had died, so half the park was closed. My dad actually jacked a guy up on the wall to force him to open the bumper car ride, just like the movie. It's unbelievable. And then we went north and went up to Santa Barbara to visit my aunt. And of course, by that time, I was bouncing off the walls. And so they stuffed me in the garage, and he handed me a box of parts. And I already was kind of into electronics, but he handed me a box of parts and a couple books. And I built a mic preamp out of a 2N107 transistor and a bunch of parts. And it worked. I had a microphone and a speaker, and I talked in, and it came out of the speaker, and it was the most amazing experience of my life. And that got me started. And then from that point, I started writing letters to people, and one of the people I used to write letters to was Bob Moog, and he used to send me schematics, and he really encouraged me. And of course, Walter Carlos used to play those tours where he did the switched on Bach, and I never met him in grade school, but I got a chance to meet him when he became a her at the AES show one year. And that affected me my whole life. So that's basically it. That was the beginning. Well, the synthesizer was it was the first instrument since the saxophone that had been invented as a new instrument. And I was always intrigued by it because I liked the filters and I liked the voltage control, and it was so electronic, and there was so much. He was so voluntary with everything. It was all like this, this whole movement of people that were experimenting with stuff. We had the theremins, we had, all kinds of, gadgets like that. And I really wanted to build a synthesizer, and I didn't have the money to do it. So I started writing people, and I wrote him, and he wrote me back, and he said that he's going to have one of his engineers, start a conversation with me. And he would send me these schematics, and these schematics were of, the history of synthesizers, tube synthesizers, things that people, back in the tube days were doing this stuff, but it was all experimental, and he was the first one that actually commercialized it and turned it into a product. And it got me interested in filters and oscillators, different things like that. And from there, a bunch of us, we used to modify mini Moogs for people. We'd put voltage indicators on them because one of the rails would always fail. And we put a little LED that you could switch the switch off, and the LED would match the two oscillators together, so you could tune it from the 440 oscillator. You could tune it right before you went into a solo because the light would blink like this. And that was kind of where that led, and that kind of got me into the whole music end of things, the music business end of things. I went on the road with a band, left my hometown. We toured around. It was a club band. I ended up at a nightclub in Michigan, Niles, Michigan, a place called Shula's. Right next to Shula's was the Notre Dame with all the girls, of course. There was Electro Voice and there was Crown, and I immediately got to know all those guys. I used to hang out at Electro Voice. I was in their anechoic chamber before. Went to Crown. They would bring stuff to our club, and we had those big white horns that Evie came out with. We had the first ones of those. We had the TL cabinets when Thiel came up with those. We had those in the club. We had a Soundcraft console, the 1604, the one that was in the metal case. We had one of the first ones of those. I became friends with the Sound Factory, which was not the studio in Hollywood, but it was a music store in Kalamazoo. Charlie Wicks, who started Proco Cables after that, and got into that whole kind of thing, and that sort of got me, going into the pro audio stuff. And then I moved to Washington D.C. with a band, Stayed with the band for a while, became the house sound man at a nightclub called the Bayou Nightclub, which is a great documentary on that club that was just released. There we did, Dire Straits played their first concert there, Foreigner played their first concert there, Kiss played their first shows there, Pat Benatar, all these bands, their showcase room was the Bayou. And then I got an opportunity to go to a company called Datatronics, which was a company in Reston that had contracted to build API products. And I went out there and talked to those guys and started working out there, and at the same time working at a recording studio in Washington, D.C. And we had a few API modules, and I started working out there as a technician and stayed there for 2.5 years and ended up, we had developed a couple of neat products. One of them was the credit card slide thing for payphones. And that became a real big thing because that's when long distance came out. That was right after MCI forced AT&T into, they got broken up by the federal government for antitrust violations. So now all of a sudden the whole long distance thing was wide open. They wanted to sell that, and they owned the API stuff, and they couldn't sell it all at once. So they tried to get rid of the API part of it to lower the price of the company, and there was little interest in buying it. So the president of the company approached me and said, you know, you've always been interested in this. Would you be interested in buying it? And I said, yeah. I had no clue. I mean, it was just like, you know, Fred off the street. And so they set up a payment plan, and I bought API from them and moved it into a 20 by 20 room office. And my first customer was Shelly Yakis from A&M Records, and from then on, we moved into a 1,500 square foot place, and then a 5,000 square foot place, and then I sold the company. We had built about 35, 40 consoles. During that period of time, we came up with the Legacy. Well, we had the first totally resettable console that was all software-based with a touchscreen, hence the touchscreen. I invented that, by the way. We did that. We had the Legacy Plus, and then the Vision console. And then I left the company and started Tonelux. And then Tonelux was something that I wanted to do on my own, because one of the things that was always a factor with the API was that it was an existing tone and an existing circuit design, and I wanted to do something on my own. So I did Tonelux, and basically that, and sold that company a few years ago. So those are the two primary ones that I was involved in. Well, you know, my parents were both in big bands. My mom and dad met on a rotating stage. They were both sax players. And so our family was always music and always art. Lived in kind of an arty, sort of, not really an art colony, but Traverse City, Michigan was very much an art center, music and painting and sculpture and stuff. And so when the Beatles were coming out and stuff like that, my parents just embraced that kind of music. They just thought it was great. There was never any kind of a hesitation of, oh, you shouldn't listen to this, you should. I was never told once not to listen to anything, even through the Alice Cooper days. My mother always liked Ringo Starr because he had great meter, and that taught me about meter, and it became an obsession, which, you know, caused a few drummers to quit some bands when I was in the studio. But between the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, and I remember when the first Led Zeppelin record came out, I was like, oh my God, listen to these drums, listen to this guitar stuff, you know. But it was Dave Clark 5, it was, you know, that kind of stuff. But those are the influential bands, and those are kind of like the things that you strive to get in the studio, were those kind of sounds, which I never actually got the Led Zeppelin sound until I did a session with Andy Johns, may he rest in peace. And he showed me the miking technique that he used to mic the Led Zeppelin drums. So I tried it on a session one time and nailed it, and it was like, if I never recorded again after that, I would have been happy. But that was where my influence came from. It came from, you know, very well recorded, very well engineered, big big bands. I was never really a Stones fan. Those kind of bands I just didn't think sounded that great. I liked Deep Purple, but their Machine Head record was a little dirty, so I didn't really learn a lot from that, except the drummer played his ass off. But yeah, that's that kind of stuff. Loggins and Messina, I always liked this stuff, and it's funny because Jim and Messina and I are very, very close friends now, and he is. I just used to look up to his guitar playing and his production skills for so much when I was younger, and now working with him in the studio and stuff like that, it's just a riot. But all those things, I never really had one particular type of music. I looked at all the different kinds of musics, and that's one of the reasons why I was a successful engineer in the studios, because I could do gospel, I could do heavy metal, I could do acoustic stuff, like that. Being a friend of Les Paul was probably, because my mother knew of him, and he would always come to the shows, and he would always stop by the booth because he knew the people at API. He knew Saul Walker, who is an absolute dear friend. Saul is one of my heroes. He would always come by the booth, and so he invited me up to his house once. So a bunch of us went up to visit him in New Jersey and spent the day there and just talked about just dorky stuff. I mean, it was just the most amazing time, And so that from that point on, being his friend, going to see him play at the Iridium, and being friends with his son and just the people around him, that was probably the most exciting, because he was somebody that was from my parents' era, that was my friend as well, and that was a influential thing. Nowadays, I think probably Jim Messina. Jimmy is probably one of my best friends, and he's the width of things that he's done throughout his life have always been a cool thing, to be able to like an artist and then be a friend of that artist. To me, and that's one of the goals when I with both of my companies. I never did endorsements. I never asked for things to do that, and because of that, the people that bought my products became my friends, and they're still friends today. The artists, the engineers, the producers, they're people that are my life right now. They're my my friends, my circle of friends. But I've always tried to do that. I've tried to make those people feel like they're getting their money's worth and trust me and trust them, and friendships have grown from it. Yeah. Well, everybody knows I'm one of the biggest smartasses, unfiltered smartasses on the face of the earth. And the first thing that I thought of was, what comes to my mind was, looking at it like it was a pinball machine. And I said, yeah, well, check that out. It's a pinball machine. And, and I'm not one to resist technology changes, because I put a touch screen in a console in 1996 that it was working with 286 computers and stuff, and it was really cool. It was a very functional thing. So I've always liked touching things like that. I thought those kind of interfaces save time. One of the things that I learned through building consoles and building all this stuff and working with these artists is trying to eliminate the groove buster, because there's always that thing that takes up time and just sucks the life out of a session. And when I started looking at the Raven and I started looking at the videos, and I started looking at this like, this is just way too fast. Because, when the DAWs took hold, there was that changeover. And the changeovers are always painful because people don't want to change. There's the ones that do, the ones that don't, and the ones that do because they have to. And, so people were trying to get used to this stuff. And so, we're 10 years into this now. The bugs are worked out of it. They sound really good. They work really well. But there's always been this disconnect between using that and a controller, or using that and a mouse. I mean, one channel at a time, for God's sakes. It's like, my whole thing was one knob, one function. It's in front of you. You reach for a fader. Doing a live show, I don't want to have to hit a page to turn the EQ down, and because something's feeding back. It just drives me nuts, And I started watching these videos, and I'm starting to see, moving more than one fader at a time, and wiping your hand across the solo, and then I see this vocal comping thing that, vocal comping, it was like, I don't know how many boxes I made for people that had mutes and had faders and had, all these things so you could do vocal comps. And I see this guy wiping his finger across, going, yeah, I like that, boom, yeah, I like that, boom, yeah, next one, move it across, wipe your finger, do it. And I'm sitting there going like, God, I did the math, I just, some fantasy math thing, and over like a 10-year period of time, it like gives you back 2 years of your life, having everything in front of you like a console. And it just became evident that, Pro Tools and DAWs are here to stay, period. That's it. It's over with. That discussion is in the past. Now we have the interface problem. Now we have to get back to what 50 years of engineering made the most efficient with these consoles. And now that's all out the window. So now we look at, okay, how can we merge the two? So basically this is it. And I have no complaints. I look at it and I go, I hit a button and the plug-in pops up. I said, you can't even do that in a studio. You want to adjust a compressor and you have to turn around and fiddle with it and come back. Here you hit the button and it's like your assistant walks up to you and holds it in front of you. It's like, make the adjustment. All right, put it back in the rack, and he goes and stuffs it back in the rack. I mean, there's nothing faster than that. And there was a guy who did a whole bunch of study on this kind of stuff about killing time and pie charts and all this stuff. And that was when I first realized that any motion that you take to do something that requires more than one thing, you're wasting time. And you got an artist sitting there, and the old Studer machine where the switch would blink, the stop button would blink. And I think they did that to remind you that the machine's not running. It's like blinking. It's like, hello, can we get moving here? And this, to me, this just wipes all that out. More so than a controller, more so than a mouse, more so than anything. It just eliminates the wasted time. And so that's when I started, I think I called Steven a year ago and said, if you need any help with any of this stuff, please, let me know. So here I am. I think 2053 will probably have cranial interfaces, and everybody will have a 3D printer. So that's there's endless possibilities. I look at technology as a and I've said this probably a million times. I try to say this in any interview that I've ever done, or any paper I've ever written. But technology is like a freight train on tracks, and it's moving forward. And there's three places you can be. You can be on the train, you can be on the tracks, or you can be on the sidelines. I prefer to be on the train. In fact, I prefer to drive the train because it's going to change anyway. It's just like Pro Tools when it came out. It's going to change. Here it is. It's too easy. There's too many things that it saves you with. Same with this. As everything gets better, things get improved. The only thing that you could do beyond this is when you go to the screens that are just holograms and you're touching things in midair. Anything that maximizes your ability to control what you're doing is going to be where the future is headed. With all the plugins and things like that, one of the things that I've noticed with the Slate stuff is that with an industry of, early on especially, industry of mediocre plugins where people say, well, they're just an approximation of the hardware, which is good because a lot of kids that couldn't afford a Pultec could buy the plug-in and stuff. One of the things that Slate has done is they've made plugins real, and I've noticed that it started out when I had Slate Trigger and I replaced some drums and merged a mix with the remix that I did, the old mix and my new mix, and just laid them right on top of each other because the artist liked both of them. And listening to the drums, and they were dead on in phase, I was just going like, this is impossible. And so I started giving them a listen, and I noticed that the quality and the tone of the plugins were so much more hardware-like that I think that eventually we'll be in a world where things will be in software. There's always going to be hardware devices that are either too complex or just too cool sounding to do away with. And I'm not saying that any of that stuff eliminates hardware, but in a world of a billion different plugins, I think that that is where the direction is going to be. And one of the coolest things that you can do with that sort of direction is that you can do things that you can't do in hardware. There's ways of manipulating things. There's equalization things. There's using no phase shift on rolling off something, and different things that are just impossible to do in hardware. So, like I said, the train is moving forward. You're on the train or you're off the train. I think Slate's on the train. I've been on the train my whole life. I prefer to drive the train, like I said. I think the people that resist it and say that it's only a fad or only this or only that are people that will find themselves on the sidelines. And there were a few people that have said that to me, and I look at them and I go, look, I'm a console guy. I'm Mr. Analog to a lot of people, and I look at this kind of thing, and I think this kind of thing is an awesome product, and this is where things are heading. So I think that's wide open. It could go anywhere, but I don't think that resisting it or trying to hold it back is the smart thing to do. So I'm all for this.